Without further ado, then, my pleasure is to introduce you Richard Dubourg, who's an economist working in a consulting company, and he's been a lot involved in applying for, helping companies to apply for authorization, and we thought it would be quite useful now for him, and then others are following him, to give their own experiences from the application process, so that the sort of baton or relay is passed from some experience to get new experiences. So, Richard, please.
Matty, afternoon, everybody. Yes, Matty asked me to, well, Matty and the Muppets asked me to talk about applying for authorization as a single downstream user. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about why the pros and cons of applying as a downstream user. In fact, you'll realize that we've already covered a few of those points, at least, in the previous presentations, which is a good thing, right? We're reinforcing the same message that we're not disagreeing on things. I'm going to talk about the application for authorization, which was submitted by Grohe for chrome trioxide. I'll talk about some features and approaches that we used in that application, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the outcomes and what my conclusions are. Just a little bit. This is not a trade fair, but I didn't know I was going to get an introduction. So just to let you, yeah, I'm an economist. I've been doing it for 25 years in government, regulation, academia, consultancy. I was 2 years at ECHA as an SEA coordinator at the time when we were developing a lot of the ideas about how to do authorization, and subsequently I've started doing it in practice and finding out how close or not we were in terms of our recommendations. I've done about 15 applications, I think, so far, or I've been involved in. I've been a co-author on about 8, I think. So I think I've got a certain amount of practical application experience, because I write the things, so I'm hoping that I can give you some of that experience today. So why apply as a single downstream user? And there's lots of reasons. This is not showing everything. It's because the text, the font is changing. The first reason is, so there's lots of reasons, and there's a whole list of them, and I'll just sort of like talk about a few. That's not exhaustive. But the main thing is that you're describing your own situation. And your own situation, your own processes, your own businesses, you know them better, so you can describe them better. The scope is limited, relatively speaking, compared with other types of applications, so you can provide more detail. You're generating your own information. You're not reliant on others to generate it, so you're in control more. When it comes down to your use conditions, they are also under your own control, at least in principle, at least. And if you want to improve them, you can improve them. You're not subject to the vagaries of what other companies might be doing. Your non-use scenario can be, that you describe in the application, can be the real non-use scenario. It's not a hypothetical one. It's not one that you have to guess, which might occur in certain types of applications. It, in principle, should be the thing that your company would do if you didn't get the authorization. It should be the actual non-use scenario. Your application can be tailored to your own circumstances rather than the circumstances of an average group of companies, and you can, and in a more strategic sense, if you're the holder of a downstream application, you're effectively able to offer a guaranteed ability to demand product from importers. So in that respect, you're signaling your ability to have a position in the market specific to yourself. But there are also some cons, and I think the most important one probably is cost. Relatively speaking, we're talking about an application which in principle has more detail and more information. It requires more resources, more internal resources, more external resources. You're not sharing those costs with anybody. They're coming down to you. And you've got to generate it all yourself. And that can be quite difficult sometimes if you struggle to get buy-in from other parts of your business. In many respects, that might not be any different from if you're part of a bigger consortium, but if you've got lots of companies in a consortium all motivated to provide information, then you've got some insurance if you yourself fail. But when you're on your own, then if you don't generate the information, then you're not generating a good application. A more technical one might be that we've found is that downstream users do not necessarily always understand their technology or their substance particularly. They might be consumers for the technology that they're using. They know how it works, but they didn't develop it, and hence they might struggle to understand exactly what the role of a substance might be, or what the alternatives might be. They might not even do any R&D to understand that, because it's not really their role. And another more strategic downside, which we've already talked about, is that you only authorize yourself as a downstream user. You don't authorize any upstream uses. So you can authorize an import if it's just a straight placing on the market in the form that you use. But if it needs to be manipulated in any way, for instance formulation, then you can't cover that in your authorization. So I'm going to talk about the grower application. I'll just give you a bit of background to that. Grower, if you haven't heard of them, they're a high-end as well as a more mass market, but very much a high-end sanitary ware producer in Europe and worldwide. You'll see grower taps everywhere. I don't know whether Eka might even have some. You see them in lots of hotels and stuff. So they're a very prominent high-end producer of taps, shower fittings across the whole range of chrome stuff. They have worldwide production facilities, not necessarily as part of Grower, but as part of the wider group that they're part of. So they have, in theory, and in practice, access to those facilities worldwide. They cover a whole range of surfaces. We're talking about chrome trioxide and hard chrome plating, which is 95% of chrome's business. But they do also have practical experience, either now or in the past, of many other types of surfaces, but chrome dominates. They were a member of CTAC, the Chrome Trioxide Authorisation Consortium. The application that they were part of was entitled, the use was functional chrome plating with decorative character. And then Grohe came to us because CTAC were proposing to go for a 7-year review period, and Grohe felt that they had the case and the information to go for longer than that. So they came to me to talk about how to put together a downstream user, which we initially thought would be a quick update of the CTAC dossier, so that we could present it in a more Grohe context and go for a longer review period. Didn't quite work out as simple as that. So I'll talk about a few features of the application, the use definitions we used, the market analysis that we did, the non-use scenario that we developed, and then a bit about the review period, because ultimately it was the review period that Grohe were most interested in. So firstly, on use definitions, in interrogating our Grohe people about their use of chrome and how it fitted into their activities and their market, we discovered effectively that they actually use chrome in two ways. And one is for the traditional hard chrome plating of plastics and metal, but the other is actually that they use it for an etching function where you pre-etch plastic substrates before you chrome plate it. And the important thing about this was that there were clearly different substitution possibilities for the etching activity. And Grohe were in fact actively engaged with a couple of suppliers, potential suppliers, to try and develop this alternative to chrome in the etching function. Now, we like this primarily because it enables us to be more specific about the way Grohe uses chrome, but it also meant that we were actually able to talk about a shorter review period for the more realistic substitution on the etching side to demonstrate that Grohe were committed to substitution. And by implication to say that they were also committed to substitute, if possible, in other areas, if it were possible, but by implication it's not. So there was a certain sort of quid pro quo going on, I think, whereby it was, we're doing our bit where we can, but where we can't, we'd like to see some recognition. So that enabled us to actually separate out the uses of chrome between plastic and metal substrates. It actually enabled us to strengthen the arguments for the AOA on plating, primarily because it drew attention to the fact that there are imperfect substitutes for chrome between metal and plastic substrates. You can't readily apply one and to the other. And I'll explain a little bit why on the next slide. It was also the case that doing this enabled us to this might well be seen as being a sort of like a bit of a trick of the consultant's light, if you like. But if we're trying to explain why Grohe deserves a longer review period than that sought by CTAC, then we're looking for ways to distinguish the application from CTACs, and this was one way in which we were able to do that. We did an awful lot of market analysis. This was quite tricky because there are alternatives to hard chrome plating out there, but they are absolutely tiny. They are very specialist in principle, and it's actually very difficult to find evidence of them because most of the major sources of information and market intelligence don't even mention them. So there's a certain amount of, you're looking for something, you're trying to demonstrate that it's not there, but because you've got no information about it, it's actually difficult to demonstrate that it's not there. So there's a certain sort of black swan problem. But in doing that, sort of like, I think it enabled us to really try and explain the role of the niche, the more niche uses, and to try and provide a more convincing argument as to why hard chrome is the dominant substance for use in this sector. As I said before, with hard chrome, there's no clear alternative which can be applied to both metal substrates and plastic ones, and that's largely down to because of a color matching problem. So if you want to provide a whole range of products which all match nicely for your use in your bathroom, some are plastic, some are metal, you can't really do that readily with the alternatives that are out there. And if there are alternatives out there, they tend to be quite partial in their provision onto the market. So the one famous non-hard chrome supplier in the EU, which you might be aware of, and I won't mention it by name, but they're mass market. They're well known for having substituted out of chrome several years ago. We did Grohe did some quite heavy testing to demonstrate that technically speaking, you couldn't use those products in the same heavy use market that Grohe supplies, particularly the professional market, hotels, etc. It's also the case that those products are marketed, are manufactured outside of the EU, and it wouldn't be economical for Grohe to manufacture them within the EU. So in a sense, even if you were to adopt them as a non-use scenario, it would still involve some sort of relocation. So this enabled us effectively to argue in the end that these performance weaknesses and the dominance of chrome in Europe meant that any attempt to switch large scale into non-chrome products would really just result in a shift to imported products rather than switch to substitution products. And that enabled us to argue for the reason why a relocation argument, non-use scenario would be more justified than a substitution one. This market analysis appeared in the analysis of alternatives. It sounds like it's something that should be in the socio-economic analysis. It was in the analysis of alternatives because we were very much trying to understand the role of different substitutes that are out there in the overall market and in growers' market, and hence how they affect the alternatives choices that grower has. On the non-use scenario, initially we experienced some reluctance to consider a non-use scenario. Hard chrome is so at the heart of growers' culture that if you say, so what about the alternatives to hard chrome? They say, there are no alternatives to hard chrome. So it took some teasing out, and I think being an independent consultant helps you to do that. We overcame it by engaging with senior management who could understand a bit more about the way a grower might manage supply interruptions, how it might use its global structure. And in that sense, I think there was a certain amount of intelligent scrutiny that we could apply to growers' case to understand and ultimately to sort of like develop a non-use scenario for them. They hadn't necessarily thought through in so much detail before what their non-use scenario would be, but this enabled them to do it. And we identified a relocation to Thailand, and we engaged with the site manager there to actually estimate how much this thing would cost, closing down sites in the EU and expanding them into outside of the EU. And we modeled this framework, and actually I think the result was a genuinely credible non-use scenario. It'll always have some uncertainties to them because the numbers attached are not the numbers necessarily you would get if you went out to formal tender, etc., for this as a project. But I'm confident that this is the strategy that they would have adopted if they had to give up chrome in Europe. And finally, on the review period argumentation, this is another sort of consultant trick, I guess. The argumentation followed the ECHA guidance very closely. The ECHA guidance is very clear as to what criteria need to be met to justify 12 years. And they are the continuing dominance of hard chrome, which we use the market analysis to demonstrate, the fact that that there would be imports, not substitutes, if there was a large-scale switch to alternatives because of the critical weaknesses in the alternatives, and hence that the non-use scenario would always be relocation, and hence the costs of closure would be high and continuing. And then we estimated the risks elsewhere, and they were comparatively low. And because we had a good market analysis based on growers' market history of understanding alternatives, we were able to talk about the R&D that grower had done, was going to continue to do, but also give a realistic assessment of the prospects of development alternatives. And that concluded that implementation, even if it was feasible, was going to take a long time, including because of a commitment through guarantees to need to provide effectively legacy spare parts. So the argument effectively was there's no way that grower could substitute within the normal period of 7 years. And if you can demonstrate that convincingly, then 12 years becomes the default. So you sort of turn around the argument, and rather present an argument for 12 years, you say why you couldn't do 7 years. And as I said before, for etching, we requested a shorter review period, and I think that sort of like was useful in demonstrating ECHA's growers' commitment to substitution in this case. So this is the final slide. So the outcome was Grohe got its 12 years for plating and the 9 years that it requested for etching. What was supposed to be a CTAC update became a fairly heavy bottom-up dossier. It was much closer to a bespoke application in the end. But I think that was because of we needed to re-engineer and re-understand the arguments from Grohe's perspective. And sometimes updating a document is harder than writing a new one from scratch. I think that the market analysis was key to us being able to demonstrate that the market for Chrome was solid and likely to continue. And that was what underpinned the argument in favor of a long review period. The non-use scenario was very much a feasible one. And as I said at the start, this was not a low-cost option. It would have been cheaper for Grohe just to stay with CTAC. But they got the 12 years and the additional security that they were looking for, but at a significant, at an additional cost. And that was because the 12 years comes from an additional confidence in the analysis we provide, in the evidence that's provided, in the data, the real data that's provided, relating specifically to Grohe's situation. As a final point, I'd say also that the one thing that Grohe got through the process is almost a bespoke strategic analysis of the best way for them to respond to the authorization requirements. And that can work both ways. We've talked sort of about the decision as to what sort of authorization to apply for. But then there's also the question of whether you need to apply for authorization at all. And this sort of analysis could well have helped Grohe to decide that they didn't need to apply for authorization. They did have a cheaper alternative they could have followed. At the same time, though, it's important to realize that this approach gives Grohe the opportunity to realize that authorization is the cheapest way for them. It enables them to avoid costly substitutions, which might be motivated by a desire to avoid the regulatory framework completely. And I think this is that sort of personalized strategic assessment for them was something that they really appreciated in the end. Sorry if I overran a little bit, but